Welcome. My name is Matt Taylor, and I am a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And this is an event sponsored by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, and we're grateful that you're here with us. We are now roughly 1 week out from the presidential election, from living in a moment that is challenging and confusing for many of us. And a number of months ago, were trying to figure out how we as ICJS, as the kind of broader interreligious community, could debrief and think about this moment. We were not sure what it would be like a week out from the election. And so we were trying to think through who would be some voices, who would be some people that we could trust to speak to whatever the moment may present itself to be with the outcome of the election, or we weren't even sure whether there would be an outcome of the election at this point. And in our planning conversations, we were saying, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could have Amanda Tyler and Sarah Posner together analyzing this stuff for us? Do you think they'd do it? And they agreed. And so we're really grateful to have them with us. And these are voices that I trust, that I look to for analysis and insight, but also for strength and solidarity in challenging times. And so I'm just very, very grateful for them being here. So let me introduce our panelists. So Amanda Tyler is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. It's a religious advocacy group made up of lawyers and ministers and scholars, drawing on the best of the Baptist tradition and its care for religious liberty and conscience and the freedom of individuals. She is also the lead organizer of the Baptist Joint Committee's campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. If you've heard of that, that is organized by the BJC, and Amanda is the one who heads that up. She's testified multiple times before Congress on Christian nationalism. And she is also the author of the newly released and boldly titled How to End Christian Nationalism. I'm going to put the link to this in our chat here. So came out 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, Amanda, is that right?
Yeah, 3 weeks ago
3 weeks ago. Wow, okay. So what a time to publish a book. Grateful for you to be here. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And Sarah Posner is one of the most respected investigative journalists and analysts in the country, looking at the religious right and at Christian nationalism. She is a columnist at MSNBC, writes a very, very valuable column. I try to not miss them. And she is also the author of a book called Unholy: How White Christian Nationalists Powered the Trump Presidency and the Devastating Legacy They Left Behind, which was first published in 2020. And I guess, unfortunately, is still as relevant as it was in 2020. So, Sarah, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So as we're getting started here, I think let's start in the space of feelings and reactions and just kind of setting the table for the conversation that we want to have. So as you reflect on this past election, the past week, as you have processed, and as you think about what is coming in a second Trump administration, what is the top area of concern that you have, or at least maybe not but a top area of concern that you have as you think about what's to come in a second Trump administration? Sarah, do you maybe want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I think very broadly, their efforts at mass deportations, which may turn into concentration camps on U.S. soil. But with regard to what the Christian right in particular wants, I think that they are going to focus on making more gains, in their view, on the abortion issue, to expand out beyond what their victory in Dobbs got them, which was sending it back to the states. They will want some kind of national abortion ban, whether that is legislation to put on Trump's desk to ban abortion outright nationwide, or if they find that politically infeasible, or maybe even if they don't, to backdoor abortion bans through agency or regulatory action, such as revoking the FDA approval of the abortion pill mifepristone, which they tried to do through litigation unsuccessfully. But that was something that they've talked about wanting to do, given the power at the Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA. And I think it's not beyond one's imagination to see them engaging in some kind of surveillance to assist states where abortion is illegal, in prosecuting potentially women or anyone who helps them obtain an abortion if they cross state lines. So I think that all of those things are, and possibly more, are on the table. But I think that people need to understand that as much as the Christian right saw Dobbs as a victory, they don't see that as the end.
Yeah, and I mean, it is. We just sometimes talk about the Overton window, right? What is an acceptable realm of conversation and discourse and proposals, and it is really quite amazing what is within that Overton window around abortion in the country right now. Amanda, what's top of mind for you right now?
Yeah, I'm going to do kind of an overarching concern and then drill down into maybe my top policy concern right now. I mean, the overarching concern is really just that we as Americans have just elected through free and fair elections a leader with authoritarian intentions and tendencies. And, the example that Sarah just gave certainly fits into what authoritarianism looks like, doing by executive order, fiat, surveillance, what could not be accomplished through the legal system, and what voters in states that had it on the ballot around the country rejected by Democratic majorities in states across the country. And I fear that kind of authoritarian takeover of American democracy we will be met with constantly over the next 4 years, and we will have so many opportunities to push back against it. For those of us who live and work around the DC area, I also feel a lot of dread about the constant chaos that we experienced in the first Trump administration, where just all norms of how Washington works were totally flipped on their head. And I think, most people think that this next 4 years will be even more chaotic in the way that the administration operates. And so we are all in for an exhausting time fighting authoritarianism. But my number one policy concern, I've come to think that what the Muslim travel ban was to the first Trump administration, his campaign promise to enact the largest deportation in American, if not world history, is what is top of mind on his policy agenda for a second Trump administration. And as Sarah pointed out, to actually accomplish this campaign promise would mean mass raids, racial targeting in certain areas of the country and in neighborhoods, and the use of camps or prisons in order to detain people while they await adjudication for deportation. This is a nightmare scenario for our country and for the millions of people, Americans, who would be affected by this, either because they personally lack the legal documents to be in the country, or someone in their family or their friends group or their church does. That the implications for this on American society are grave. And I just think that we will, starting in January, see efforts to actually enact this campaign promise in some way.
Okay, so a sobering beginning. Sometimes I feel like we have these conversations about Christian nationalism, the religious right, American evangelicalism, American Christianity. And we wanted to have this conversation about the impact of religion on this election and on the coming administration. But I think it helps to keep our categories straight. So can you help us kind of parse these different terms? So we've got the religious right, we've got Christian nationalism, we've got the evangelicalism, sometimes just white evangelicalism, and then the kind of broader world of American Christianity. How do you differentiate amongst these different kind of terms?
So when I talk about the Christian right or the religious right, I'm referring specifically to a political movement and a political apparatus that was built starting in the late 1970s, in the wake of Watergate and all the social and political upheaval of the 1960s. There were political activists who joined forces with pastors and televangelists and even Catholic activists to build an infrastructure that we see still today. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. That is a product of this building of this infrastructure over these past decades. And this movement decided that it was going to make common cause with the Republican Party and be attached at the hip with the Republican Party and use its electoral force to ensure the election of not just Republican presidents, but senators, House members, local state races, and the like. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the Christian right, which does include white evangelicals, white Catholics. It also includes, people who are, neither Catholic nor evangelical. But that was the core of it. When I talk about white evangelicals, I'm talking specifically about evangelicals, people who are born again, who believe that in salvation by Jesus Christ, and many and in spreading the gospel around the world. And many of them belong to non-denominational churches, and it's a pretty diverse movement in terms of some theology, but politically it's very coherent and homogenous. And many of their beliefs about their role in the world and their role in politics are the same as Christian nationalism. They basically invented a lot of the worldview that we now call Christian nationalism. Specifically, that God intended America to be a Christian nation, that Christian nation has strayed from its divine founding, and that it's the duty, in fact, the mandate of God-fearing Christians in the United States to engage in both spiritual warfare and political action to restore that Christian nation. So we call that Christian nationalism, but it's also a mindset that was created and perpetuated by white evangelical pastors, televangelists, and political activists.
Got it. And Amanda,
So,
do you have anything else?
Yeah. I appreciate that framing, Sarah, and I agree, and I think it's good to start with the movement side here, and think about how the movement of the religious right, which has been so active over the past 5 decades now, really, and growing in importance and in influence over American democracy, how that plays a role. I have a slightly different view on Christian nationalism as an ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. And while I certainly think that ideology is at work in the movement, I don't think that the movement invented it. I think that the ideology is much, much older, and we can see it showing up in different pieces of American history, really pre-founding, right? That the ideology that to be a real American, one has to be Christian, but that the Christian is less about a particular religion or theology, and instead a racial identity or a ethno-national identity of whiteness. That ideology has been an undercurrent at times, and in other times of a rising tide of Christian nationalism throughout American history at different points, and that it undercuts a foundational constitutional promise of religious freedom for all people. That though we have a constitutional framework that would have a promise that we have equal belonging without regard to religion, this ideology of Christian nationalism, which also includes Christian supremacy, has meant that promise hasn't been fulfilled, that we have an effective caste system with white Christian Protestant men at the top and everyone else, depending on what their identity is, at a lower rung on the caste system. And I do think that the movement of Christian nationalism includes both this kind of classical Christian right group, which is somewhat institutional in many ways, and a much less formal movement that has oftentimes been, I think, radicalized online, radicalized in different in-person gatherings like the Reawaken America tour, and different leaders from, of course, this is Matt, your expertise with the New Apostolic Reformation. And so the Christian nationalism movement includes people from the religious or Christian right, but also has included some of these other actors who have joined the group, but they all have common cause, which is authoritarian theocracy and destroying the democratic institutions of the country.
Got it. So we've got kind of the infrastructure of the Christian right that was built over decades. We've got the ideology of Christian nationalism that was built over centuries, but it's kind of congealed into its present form, especially around evangelicalism and white evangelicalism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So let's think back about this bruising presidential campaign that we've just been through. And what role did Christian nationalism play in this campaign? And this is for both of you, but maybe we can start with Amanda and then go to Sarah. And then also, what promises did Donald Trump make to his Christian nationalist or conservative Christian constituents, or to the Christian right infrastructure, or what are the promises that he sees? I mean, the thing he said in his acceptance speech, right, was the slogan is going to be promises made, promises kept. What were the promises, and what does he now feel beholden to keep?
Yeah. Well, I think we saw the rhetoric of Christian nationalism leveraged at many different points in the campaign. The rhetoric of America is a Christian nation, the flag-wrapped cross, the images of white Jesus, towards the end of the campaign, even shouting Jesus is Lord or Jesus is King as a campaign slogan at political rallies, which, as an aside, as a Christian myself, I just find completely disgusting to take the central confession of the Christian faith, which says that our authority is ultimately not earthly authority at all, and to use it and try to elect an authoritarian leader. And then I think we saw some of these prophecies, in quotes, that Trump would be elected, really gained steam around the time of the assassination attempt in July, with just speech after speech at the Republican National Convention claiming that God had saved Trump in order to win the presidency. And all of these are not just feeding on this language of Christian nationalism that merges religious and political authority into one, but also undercutting the whole idea of a free and fair election. Voters choose the president, not God. And to put in the minds of people that any result that does not end in the election of Donald Trump is somehow illegitimate, was laying the groundwork for a possible challenge. Of course, we know because voters did elect Donald Trump, we're not going to see that kind of violence, and that is indeed a very good thing. But they were laying the groundwork for that kind of violent uprising, if necessary, if the election results did not go their way. And as far as promises made, some of them were more explicit, directed at Christians, and kind of feeding this system of grievance or this persecution story that somehow not only are we a Christian nation, but that Christians are persecuted within the Christian nation, which again is not logically consistent, but this promise that he would institute some kind of task force to look into anti-Christian bias in the new administration, or that he would pursue Christian priorities, which again are code for some of the anti-abortion, anti-woman, anti-LGBTQ policies. And then, of course, also thinking about just the awful ads that were targeting transgender people that were used to try to galvanize a particular voting bloc as another instance of Christian nationalism at work in the election.
Sarah?
What I saw in this campaign as compared to his 2016 and his 2020 campaign was much more of an overt attempt by him and some of his allies to wrest the power base away from some of the more traditional players in the Christian right political infrastructure, leaning much more to these very online influencer characters who are much more extreme and fringe and violent in their rhetoric. And I think it bodes not well for his next administration if where he's turning to for advice on these types of matters are people who are more extreme, less grounded in the kind of inside the beltway political lobbying kind of world, and just much more popular owing to their presence on X or some other online platform. A couple of examples that I'll give about this, and I think a lot of this started to shift in July around the time of the assassination attempt and the Republican National Convention. The day after the assassination attempt, Jack Posobiec, who is a far-right Catholic influencer, author of a book titled Unhumans, which depicts anyone who disagrees with him, Democrats, liberals, as not human beings. He's a huge influencer on the right, and he has a massive following on X, Twitter. And the day after the assassination attempt, he started a Twitter meme that went kind of viral that the assassination attempt, the bullets rang out at 6:11 p.m. And he connected that. And here again, we're talking about a mindset that's very much grounded in proof texting and prophecy and like weird revelations. And so he connected 6:11 p.m. to Ephesians 6:11, which discusses the armor of God and wearing the armor of God. Of course, it does not have to do with anything that we're talking about here with the real world and assassination attempts, but he made it such. And so he claimed that Trump must have been wearing the armor of God because of this numerical coincidence. And Charlie Kirk, who's another figure very much connected in MAGA and Trump world, who, the founder of Turning Point USA, who Trump spent a lot more time with this election cycle for his Christian outreach, his evangelical outreach, he picked up on it and it spread like wildfire. And that's why you saw at the convention people talking about this very thing. At the same time, Trump shut out a lot of the traditional political players on the Christian right from the platform drafting process. And basically, had the platform drafted, he edited himself, they were banned from the room. And there was a lot of discontent about this among these previously very influential political players. These are people who have connections on the Hill, who, are the ones who organize citizen lobbying for legislation and that sort of thing. And they were basically shut out of that. And so both of those things together really signaled to me, and the rest of the campaign bore this out, that Trump is much more interested in connecting with and reaching out to the Jack Posobiec, Charlie Kirk wing of the Christian right, or of the, Christian nationalist movement, rather than these more traditional players. He didn't care if he annoyed Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council or any of the presidents of the anti-abortion groups. And I thought that was a significant shift in the way he approached this critical base of his.
Yeah, let me reflect back to you and just get your reaction really quick, because I think what we're both getting at is something very, very important, and it parallels in many ways what Trump has done with the Republican Party, right? Where he's used the platform of the Republican Party, this kind of infrastructure that was built, but then he's taken it over and turned it into this kind of MAGA movement and brought these kind of fringy outside voices into the center of the action. It sounds like what you guys are kind of saying here is that in a similar way, there was this infrastructure built of the religious right that served as a sort of platform for Trump in 2016 that he relied on. But then over time, he has kind of taken over the movement of Christian nationalism and focused it around himself and around his causes, and then kind of ramped up the rhetoric on to get people at this kind of fever pitch of fear. But it's really consolidated around him in a way that he doesn't really have even checks from the conventional infrastructure. Does that resonate?
Well, yes. And in 2016, he was very much dependent on getting the approval of people like Tony Perkins and other influential political actors in the Christian right, that the base, it was thought that the base needed to hear from those people that Trump was okay. Even at the same time that there were people in the movement who were saying that he was anointed, he was like King Cyrus, he was God, God chose him and all of that. That was going on, but he still had these kinds of relationships with these political players. Now I think he thinks he doesn't need those relationships anymore. And big question about how they're going to react to that. I mean, they complained very loudly about the platform drafting in July, and Trump land basically ignored them. And then they just kind of came back with their tail between their legs. And, that could happen again, as long as they are, getting policy-wise what they want. But I think that the base has galloped so far beyond them, and he's stolen so much of the leadership or the perceived leadership that they don't have the influence with the base that they used to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. And, I think the parallel to what's happened to the Republican Party in general is so apt, because now even establishment Republicans who oppose Trump, they have no place to go, right? They either support Trump or they're basically banished from the party. And they thought that they were in control of the voters, of the populace, and they owe their majorities or their elections to this group, and then the group takes over. And I think we're seeing that as Sarah so well explained, we're seeing that in how Christian nationalism has gotten beyond the control of the establishment, and to the detriment of everyone, right? Because it is so much more violent. It is so much more dehumanizing on every level. The language and kind of what, whether it be the mass deportation or the attacks on transgender people, that using, comparing people to animals or to being subhuman, that's what genocidal regimes start out as. And so these are really concerning impacts for a pluralistic democracy, which we still have, as long as we stand up for it in this moment.
Yeah, and speaking of standing up, let me stay with you for a minute there, Amanda. So you're trained as a lawyer, and you've testified before Congress. You're very familiar with the way that DC kind of functions and all. It's looking like I think it's been confirmed now that the House has gone for Republicans, the Senate has gone for Republicans, the White House has gone for Republicans, and they have a majority on the Supreme Court. So thinking, I mean, the courts and kind of jurisprudence, legal proceedings might be one of the few avenues of activism and protecting human rights in the midst of all of this. How do you see that landscape of the courts and litigation and all of the different dimensions of trying to kind of protect vulnerable communities, protect the rule of law as we come into this new administration?
Yeah, and when we think about courts, thinking of course also about the lower courts, and all of the positions that Trump filled in his first term, and all of the obstruction that Senate Republicans provided to any kind of Democratic nominees in other administrations, means that we have a really stacked federal judiciary in this moment. I think I am becoming more and more pessimistic about the impact of litigation to stop authoritarian tendencies. And we only have to look to the last US Supreme Court term. Well, not just the last term, but the last several years of the US Supreme Court. I mean, the US Supreme Court eventually blessed a version of the travel ban. It had to be changed a number of times, but at the end, still adopted and ruled as constitutional divisive and discriminatory immigration policy that was based in part on religion. And that decision, I believe, is a Korematsu-like decision, a decision that future generations will look back on this episode and see as profoundly wrong, and also as an example of really expanding presidential authority in ways that are not appropriate. We saw that again with the immunity decisions and the way that the Supreme Court has now insulated President Trump from criminal prosecution in almost any case, it seems like, depending on, and you know, we will see how much he tests those limits in a second term. But you know, I think it's important as we go about advocacy around the country that we don't give up on the courts, we don't give up on the Constitution, but that we view the Constitution as a kind of floor. Because at this point, there's a lot of room between what the court has ruled as legal or constitutional and what is actually right and protective of freedom in a pluralistic democracy. And so we don't give up on the floor, but we also don't cede the ground that everything that the court says is constitutional is actually helpful or freedom-giving in our pluralistic democracy. So I imagine that civil rights lawyers, immigration lawyers, healthcare and abortion rights, equal protection, all of those areas are going to be very busy over the next 4 years, as well they should be. But we cannot just think that our courts are going to save us from coming authoritarianism.
Yeah, thank you. So Sarah, one of the things I appreciate about your coverage and your analysis is you're not just tracking the white evangelical side of this, you're also looking at the Catholic side of this. And one of the, I would argue, more momentous decisions that Trump made in the course of this campaign was to choose J.D. Vance, a Catholic convert, as his running mate. So how does that choice, the choice of J.D. Vance, how does that show this changing makeup of the Christian right, like the changing landscape, the different power players and interests? And where would you locate a figure like J.D. Vance within kind of the broader tapestry of American Catholicism? And what is the presence of Vance on the ticket in the White House now? And just his connections, his influences, what does that say about kind of policy or orientation in the coming administration, do you think?
Well, I think that Vance is part of and connected to a growing far-right Catholic movement, sometimes referred to as radtrads, radical traditionalists. And it started out being more people who wanted to return to the Latin Mass, or who possibly were dissatisfied with the selection of Pope Francis because they considered him to be too liberal. But that movement has very much radicalized over the past 5 to 10 years, fueled very much by online influencers who are, like Vance, many of them converts to Catholicism. And they're very much focused on combating wokeism and kind of these very online, I don't know if like the audience knows what I mean by being very online, but being very immersed in Elon Musk's far right Twitter world. And they're very focused on things like, hating liberals, dehumanizing liberals. Somebody like Jack Posobiec comes to mind. He's a Catholic who has written this book calling his political adversaries, unhuman. Candace Owens, who's another online influencer, is very, she's also a convert, very much part of this movement. And I think that while it may not be changing the face of American Catholicism, because if you talk to cradle Catholics, they're like, who are these people? I don't recognize them. I think that they are changing the makeup of the Christian right and the Republican Party. And I think some of the other things that you hear Vance say, he doesn't really talk about theology or his religion very much, but when he's talking about things like childless cat ladies or promoting this hypernatalism of white Christians in America, this is very much part of that kind of broader online far right world. And that is kind of more of the landscape of these rad trads. So you might not see them at the Family Research Council's annual conference, but there's another annual conference called the National Conservatism Conference, which is much more explicitly anti-democracy, and where you would likely see more of those players there. So it's definitely a sign of like the changing shape of this movement. And we don't know how this all is going to turn out in terms of which power players are going to come out on top. But in many ways, they're much more radical than the Catholics, the right-wing anti-abortion Catholics who have been traditionally part of the Christian right. And another thing I would say about the changing nature of the Christian right with these kinds of new movements coming into it is we don't really know how the rad trad Catholics are going to interact with, say, the New Apostolic Reformation. So these are from a political standpoint, from a theological standpoint, and I think also from a, elbowing for power and influence standpoint, all of that remains to be seen.
Yeah, the philosopher who was very influential on the rise of the religious right, Francis Schaeffer, used to talk about co-belligerency, right?
Yes.
As the cause that unites all of these forces together. They hate the same things and they're battling against the same things. One of the questions we've had for a long time is, what happens if that coalition of co-belligerents comes to power? What will these kind of internecine struggles amongst them manifest in different ways? And I think that's very much an open question. And I also just appreciate what you're both saying in terms of, this is not your grandfather or grandmother's religious right. Things are changing very, very rapidly. New voices are emerging that are more radical, are more violent, are more aggressive. And I think that very much parallels kind of the growth of this MAGA movement in general.
And I would add one more thing,
Yeah.
that there are a lot of financial incentives for people to do this.
Yeah. These people have gotten extremely popular in the last decade. So Amanda, before we turn to the audience questions, you've just written a book on how to end Christian nationalism, how to stop Christian nationalism. What can we do? So we have 150 people on this call, citizens of the United States, well-meaning, interreligious dialogue participants, people who are engaged and concerned, who participate in religious communities, sometimes non-religious communities, sometimes activist communities. What can we do in this moment? How do we respond to this? And what role do some of our faith-based activist communities play in resisting the most dangerous parts of Trump's agenda, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think, we, as you noted, we're not even a full 7 days out from the election results at this point. And I know from conversations I've had, I've been in 3 different cities since last Tuesday talking about how to end Christian nationalism. I feel the fatigue, the despair that people are having in this moment. And I think we have to feel those feelings and then get up and do something about it, because we cannot stay mired in a defeatist posture of despair. In many ways, from a theological standpoint, that Christian nationalism as an ideology helps feed that idea of despair, because it takes an almighty God and domesticates it down to be controlled by the state in ways that we feel like there is no hope right? Whereas for so many people, you know, regardless of our religious tradition, it is our faith that provides us that hope. And so this is a time for us to, I think, really dig down into whatever grounds us as humans, you know, whether it be a religion or a moral philosophy. Kind of, this is the moment for us to be really grounded in who we are, and then to take our place in the public square, to work to protect and actually build a pluralistic democracy that works for everyone. In my book, I talk about, you know, this movement to end Christian nationalism. It's not going to be completed in any of our lifetimes. And that's because it has been so long in building to this point. But that doesn't mean that we each don't have a critical job in this moment to help to work to build that society, that pluralistic democracy that works for all of us, where all have equal belonging. And so some of the ideas that I have in the book are, you know, one, for people, you know, as we're doing here today, to understand better what Christian nationalism is, how it's driving authoritarianism, how it's driving these discriminatory policies. But then to work in communities, particularly on the local and state level, to push back against Christian nationalism. I mean, we have been focused today, as rightly we need to be, on the national picture, but we need to not get lost in these as just like policy headlines, but how these really impact people on the ground. We need to understand the stories and the people who are being targeted and who are most vulnerable to these policies, and then work in community, in multi-faith coalitions that include secular allies, to both understand better how the policies are impacting our community, and then to work together to fashion interventions. And some of those things are going to require us to be more creative and more resourceful than maybe we've ever had to be in our lifetime as Americans, for many of us. And I'll point out, the three of us are all, you know, presenting as white, and people of color have been doing this for decades and centuries in order for their own survival. And so that we can learn from our neighbors who have been about this kind of organizing for a much longer time than people in most of my communities have been. And this is the point where we really need to do that. And so I'm really encouraging people to get more directly involved in direct democracy. I'll point out, you know, one of the pieces around abortion rights from this election is the success of so many of these ballot initiatives. Those ballot initiatives are examples of direct democracy, when the people are asked, do you want this policy or not? And I take that as a sign of hope that there actually are a majority of Americans who are saying, no, we don't want authoritarianism over women's bodies and in our states. And so even if a majority of Americans voted for Trump, it doesn't mean they were voting for authoritarianism. And so we need to join across lines of political difference too, in order to understand how we protect our communities, protect our neighbors, and try to create a democracy out of what just happened.
Yeah, and just to foot stomp one of the points you're making at the end there, Amanda, I think right now, I think there are a lot of white Christians who are more center left, who are trying to think through how do we have resilience? How do we kind of form resistance? And I'll just say the Black church has been doing it for centuries. They have thought about this. They have theologized around this. They have done activism around this. And I think this is really a moment for white Christians to be in a mentored posture where we are learning from the Black church, because the Black church has a lot to teach in this moment. Okay, we have a lot of audience questions. They have generated many questions. So we're going to try to get through as many of these as we can, and recognizing we probably won't get to all of them. So I want to ask a question about the First Amendment, and how the First Amendment plays into this. So here's the question as the person wrote it. Our country was founded largely on the idea that there should be and is, according to the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion for Americans, with a separation of church and state. This is a very basic question, but how do Christian nationalists rationalize away the First Amendment? The person writing this says, I don't think they are ignoring the Bill of Rights. The same people who cling fiercely to the Second Amendment somehow think they can ignore parts of the First Amendment. Can you explain this? Or at least can you explain how they see it?
Well, so one of the chapters in my book about how to end Christian nationalism is to commit to the separation of church and state and to really embrace those foundational ideals that are included in the First Amendment. Also in Article 6 of the US Constitution, that there are no religious tests for public office, but to both the no establishment of religion by government and also the free exercise of religion. And two answers. One, aided and abetted by the US Supreme Court, the movement has redefined religious freedom to be essentially religious privilege for Christians, expanding the contours of the free exercise clause almost always in service of Christian and conservative Christian claims for their primacy over, for instance, civil rights claims or access to abortion or birth control, while also reading out really any meaningful enforcement of a no establishment principle. And so they fundamentally changed kind of how the Constitution is read. And that is one of the points I was making earlier about how just because it passes constitutional muster under this Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment does not mean it protects religious freedom. And explaining that and really arguing for policies on the state and local level that protect religious freedom are going to be more successful in this environment, I believe, than thinking that a legal claim is going to survive review by this US Supreme Court.
Thank you. So Sarah, something you said sparked someone's curiosity here. So they wrote, I'm interested in hearing more from Sarah about the financial incentives for the religious right, because you mentioned that. Can you talk a little bit about how money works in this world and how money flows, and also how does it set up these incentive structures for some of these leaders or these organizations to become more radical or to message in certain ways?
Okay, so there's several layers of this.
Yeah.
One principal origin story of all of this is the prosperity gospel and how financially beneficial that has been to its purveyors. So it is promoted by televangelists and other pastors who, say to their followers, if you sow a seed with me, you will receive supernatural thousandfold return on your investment. So it's the seed faith theology. And so, since the advent of TV, religious TV in the late 60s and early 1970s, a lot of people had made a lot of money preaching the prosperity gospel. So that's one way it happens. Another way that it is happening currently, and that continues to happen, obviously, another way that it happens is that social media has created an incentive structure to become an influencer and, make money through your social media presence. Another way of making money is getting funding from a very wealthy billionaire to promote your ideology, either through a book, a TV show, a YouTube channel. The possibilities are endless. And a third way, which we discovered just months before the election, was some people were making a lot of money with being paid by, a conduit for Russian intelligence. So, there are a lot of different incentives that come to people who were not very well known before, but might get lucky on social media with some kind of viral hit. Or, get a podcast funded and rise to the top of Apple Podcasts in popularity. So there's a pretty vast infrastructure already in place. And the incentives are not to be, the incentives are to be as outrageous as you possibly can be.
Yeah, it's a very entrepreneurial space with a lot of money flowing through it. And so these people everyone's trying to kind of catch that wave, get the attention, ride the current here. Okay, so here's just an interesting practical question that I am curious to hear, because it made me think. So somebody wrote, how can people learn about the ideology and the writings of these people? And Sarah, you've referenced Jack Sobek's books on humans a couple times, without buying those books and financially supporting those authors and those worldviews. Like, what are good sources of information that people can purchase in good conscience or participate in good conscience without putting more money into the coffers of some of the worst actors in this world, but be informed about it?
Right. So I can recommend some journalists to follow who have written about it. Um, so, in terms of players in the national conservatism movement and in the rad trad movement, Sarah Jones at New York Magazine has done some excellent coverage, and my friend Catherine Joyce has done some amazing coverage of that at Vanity Fair. So, you don't even have to read an entire book. You can go look up these very good journalists, sometimes very lengthy articles, but that would be a really, really good place to start, with particularly that wing of the movement. And as far as Trump's, like my book covers Trump from 2015 to 2021, and there are other really good books out there that would provide you a sufficient summary of what these people stand for without having to purchase their book. I did unfortunately discover that the Montgomery County Public Library owns 4 copies of Jack Posobiec's book. So maybe your library does too.
Amanda, do you have any tips?
Yeah, well, those are wonderful ideas. And for the investigative journalism side, I would add ProPublica. Ava Kaufman just wrote a long piece that was in the New York Times Magazine, specifically about, to the prior question, the funding, how 2 billionaires have really taken over the Texas legislature and are pushing a lot of what's going on here in my home state of Texas, in particular. On books, I know you didn't ask this question for me to say this, but Matt Taylor's book on the New Apostolic Reformation, you can learn all about the movement without supporting those who are pushing it. Another recent book out called Opus talks about, I think, the Catholic side of Christian nationalism. So if you do want to do a deep dive, those are some places to do it. And I would just encourage people to learn what we're up against, and then to take action, because sometimes we can get stuck in the awareness gathering arena, and that can also in its own way feel overwhelming to us.
Yeah, and I think that there's a tendency of people, I mean, I've been covering this stuff for 20 years, and I find when I talk to people at events like this, or even in-person events that are like this, people want to learn more, but you actually don't need to know that much to take the kind of action that Amanda is talking about, because you might just end up immersing yourself in details that you don't really need to know to go to your school board meeting and make a case against book bans or something like that. So I would discourage you from getting too much in the weeds and wanting to make yourself like an expert on everything. I would zero in on something that matters a lot to you and try to focus on that. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I applaud and encourage people to educate themselves and read books. But I do think that some people fall into a trap of, oh, like I need to connect every dot. Is this person in the movement connected to that person? And you don't, like, be good to yourself mental health wise too.
Yeah,
100%, totally agree.
Very good advice. And I think sometimes, as both of you have gestured to, sometimes we search for coherence where there is none, right? Part of the
Exactly.
narrative is, as Amanda was saying earlier, part of the narrative is America is a Christian nation and always has been a Christian nation. And then part of the narrative is Christians are brutally persecuted in America, right? Like you're not going to be able to reconcile those things. It's not coherent. And So sometimes just reading the literature, it feels more like reading the propaganda than actually gaining insight. And so I think, yeah, finding analysts, finding journalists, finding scholars who are giving resources for that, I think is very, very good advice. So we have a question here about the changing demographics of Donald Trump's coalition. So somebody asked specifically, we see the growing popularity of Trump among Latinos, many of whom are Pentecostal and charismatic. Do you foresee the Trump administration trying to play and speak to Latino communities as well? And I'll just note that we've also seen this in the Christian nationalism space. PRRI's recent surveys have shown, I mean, they categorize things a little bit differently, but among Hispanic Protestants is the category they use, is rising. Levels of kind of Christian nationalist sympathy and sentiment in that community are rising almost to the levels of some of these white evangelicals in some of their recent surveys. So yeah, do you have a theory as to what's going on underneath that? And then do you think that will be something that the Trump administration will be concerned about, speaking to some of these Latino communities that have supported them?
I think that the attempt by the Republican Party to bring Latinos into the GOP tent is a longstanding one. And I think some of the reasons why Trump was able to capitalize on it were what you say, the growing presence of Christian nationalism in Latino evangelical and Pentecostal charismatic communities, the rise of many of their own pastors in these communities to Trump celebrity status. And I think also, I actually think that Trump's nativist language brought some of these people into the tent because it gives you his tent. You want to have the feeling of you belong, you're not the outsider. And you're the immigrant who came the right way. Or your parents were the immigrant, or your grandparents were the immigrant who came the right way. So I think there's a lot of different factors at work, but I think that the role of Latino evangelicals was definitely a big factor.
Yeah. Amanda, did you have any?
Yeah, I would just underscore that point of don't underestimate the power of the need to belong. That this is the what's perverse about Christian nationalism. The ideology creates insider and outsider groups, and then any group is trying to look at how can I belong under this system. And so that's why, even though Christian nationalism has everything to do with white supremacy, I usually use the term Christian nationalism and white instead of white Christian nationalism, because you don't have to be white to embrace Christian nationalism. And the polling shows that, but the ideology being, if you aren't fully accepted, that accepting Christian nationalism and being part of the team might get you, Sarah said, into the tent. And so as we think about ending Christian nationalism, how in communities do we create circles of belonging that don't rely on this poisonous ideology?
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. I could talk to you guys for hours about these things. It's comforting just to have knowledgeable people speak to the present moment. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm really, really grateful for you giving this time to us and sharing so much knowledge with us. And for those of you who have joined us, please buy Sarah and Amanda's books. They are both really excellent books.
And Matt's.
Thank you. And their books will really help you make sense of the present moment. And as if you have not already signed up for ICJS for our email list, we do events like this at least every month. We do courses, so please sign up on our website, icjs.org. You will get a survey after this event asking for your feedback, and we actually read all of those responses, and it helps shape and give us insight into what we can do better in the future, what kind of events you're really interested in. So please do that, and please join us as a community, an interreligious community that is trying to stand up for truth and justice and pluralism and stand against Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in this moment. Unfortunately, we are not going out of business anytime soon. These things are all on the rise, and we can use your help. And we are so grateful for partners like Sarah and Amanda as well. So thank you all for joining us, and be strong and be courageous as we come into the coming months. Thanks.